Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes, so just relax and we'll be with you shortly. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hi, everyone. Good to see you back for another one of our webinars. My name is Michael Ibrahim, Program Manager with the Culture Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. Our focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and today we are excited to present a webinar on managing risk. This workshop is part of the Mass Cultural Council Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. As you are probably well aware, this spring we've been offering 2 free workshops every week in the areas of legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, board governance, and financial management, what we're here to talk about today. Joining us today is Johnny Lombor. He's the Senior Associate of Advisory Services at the Nonprofit Finance Fund. We're going to get started in just a minute, but a few ground rules as we get going. If you want to say hi in the chat, just give a little virtual wave. We'd like to say hi to you. This session has automatic captioning. So as you probably also know by now, auto-generated captions are provided on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you need additional accommodations to ensure your participation, just let us know when you register and we'd be happy to do that for you. If this is distracting for you, you can actually hide the subtitles in the closed captioning options at the bottom of Zoom. We will have time for questions and answers, just like we normally do throughout the presentation. Please use the Q&A function, and it keeps us organized, and we'll be able to present questions to Johnny. Also, you can be anonymous if you would like to do that as well. So use the Q&A, depending on how you want to ask your question, is just fine. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Council's YouTube channel later this week, probably tomorrow. You'll get an email from me when that is all available to be watched. My colleague Sarah Glidden is here, and she is providing some links. She's already saying hi in the chat as we go along, including the presentation for today. The session is marked at 1 hour, and that includes time for questions. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Johnny.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, or good wherever you may be on this beautiful Tuesday. I appreciate you all being here. Before we begin, I do want to mention that you are at the right webinar. That, in fact, is me in the photo. That was before facial hair, so don't go dropping off just yet. My name is Johnny Lombor, and I'm a Senior Associate at NFF. Welcome to today's session on managing risk. This is part 9 of a 12-part webinar series. For those of you who have attended one of these sessions before, welcome back. For those who are new, welcome. I want to acknowledge that today is rough, and I appreciate you all being here on a Tuesday that feels like a Monday after a holiday weekend. And to top it all off, we're here to talk about finance. Now, I know finance can be messy and difficult, but the overarching goal of these webinar sessions have been to demystify some of these financial concepts and really bring you all as plus ones to the financial party, where the drinks are good, the DJ spinning your track, and you're perhaps feeling the music a little bit. And so we're all coming into this space with different financial knowledge and experiences. We're gonna do our best to meet everyone where they're at. So let's go ahead and get started. So as we start, I want to acknowledge that we are all joining today virtually from different places. And we want to take a moment to recognize the land we reside on and acknowledge that the land we inhabit today was stolen from Indigenous community. Today, I join you all from Van Nuys, California, which is the native home of the Tongva people. I invite you to share in the chat the Indigenous territory you are joining us from. If you do not know the territory, you can click on the link that we are sharing in the chat and look it up. At NFF, we are on our journey to be an anti-racist organization with a central strategy to increase our partnerships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color led and serving organizations. We are integrating Indigenous land acknowledgements as appropriate into our sessions. At NFF, we are seeking to include voices that were previously excluded. We strive to bravely face the facts of this history, no matter how painful. I hope this acknowledgement continues to build and expand on our understanding of our world. And I invite you to learn more about the Native people in each of the respective territories you are joining us from today. As we move forward to our core content, I invite us all to do 3 collective breaths together to move us into today's session. All right, thank you all. So let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you who have joined us, you probably already know who Nonprofit Finance Fund is. But for those of you who haven't, or maybe as a refresher, NFF is a nonprofit organization as well. And we envision a society where money and knowledge come together to support just and vibrant communities. Our work is really tailored into 3 different buckets. The first is tailored capital. So we provide loans and lines of credit to other nonprofit organizations. The next is strategic advice. So it's our consulting arm, which is pretty much this engagement where we help nonprofit leaders strengthen their financial capacity through different ways. An example like this would be the webinar that we are all here for today. And the last bucket is accessible insights. So we mesh all of our learnings from our lending and our consulting practice and use our platform to advocate for a more equitable sector. And that's Nonprofit Finance Fund. That is who we are. The learning goals for today's session are threefold. One, it's really to develop an awareness of different types of organizational financial risks. The second is to build skills to manage risks with an aim towards long-term financial health. And the last goal is really to strengthen ways to communicate your long-term needs to stakeholders. So these are the 3 things that we're hoping to cover, and we'll revisit these learning goals at the end of the session. Our meeting agreements for today. Today is a learning exchange in a judgment-free zone. So we're going to speak freely and candidly. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask those. Respect any confidentiality. So what is said stays in the room, but we're also all here to learn. So what is learned leaves the room. I encourage you all to honor multiple perspectives. So if you do have any questions, speak from your own experience and also acknowledge that every experience is valid. And of course, take care of yourself and each other. Feel free to get up and stretch, do whatever you need to be present in today's session. And so we're going to be talking about long-term financial health. But in order to talk about long-term financial health, we want to acknowledge that financial health is just a larger component of what it means for your organization to be healthy in the long term. And so we do this through this strengths framework. We want to make sure that we are leveraging all of your strengths as an organization to achieve long-term health. And all of these strengths manifest themselves really into these 4 different buckets that we see here. Your relationships and your reputations. So these are your partnerships, your networks, your reputations, and access to community resources that contribute to your long-term health. You also have your people and your skills. So these are all of you on the call, driving the work, doing what it takes. Then you also have your data and know-how, how we know what we do works and how we understand our mission impact. All of these are components of mission success that ultimately lead to long-term health. And of course, you have the financial component. And this is where we're going to be spending the most time today. Finance, we're Nonprofit Finance Fund, it's in our name. And so this is where we're going to be covering the content today, but also appreciating that it is just a component of these longer term components needed for long-term health. So now that we established that we're going to be talking about finance and risk, before we dive into that, why don't we just define what risk is, right? We can't talk about risk if we don't have a common understanding and kind of perspective as to how we're approaching our conversation today. So here's a broad definition. Risk is the possibility of an event occurring that will have an impact on the achievement of objectives. This is a quote from the Institute of Internal Auditors. And I do want to point out that this is a broad definition. Notice that this definition doesn't really define risk or impact of risk as bad or good. It's really just neutral, and the outcomes can be good or bad. And so you'll want to manage to both and keep these in mind as we go through our conversation today. So there are multiple kinds of risks, and it can be helpful, and this can be a helpful framework for identifying your own risks as an organization. The first is operating risks. So these are ongoing within business as usual. I was actually just working with an arts organization, and they mentioned the constant fluctuation of ticket demand for their performances. This can be an ongoing risk that they may be facing as part of their day-to-day business. You also have strategic risks. So these are your planned choices, perhaps maybe new opportunities. You know, that same dance organization deliberately decided to produce another show right after COVID, right? They're beginning to think about their next show. And this can be a risk because of unknown demand, right? They're unsure if people are going to come back to their show. They're unsure of the capacity. They're unsure how it will go, but it's a strategic decision to plan for their next show. So these are operating and strategic risks. But there are also internal versus external risks. An internal example may be leadership transition, right? They're existing organizational structure and operations, but they're also easier to control. So perhaps any staff turnover, leadership transition, those can be risks that organizations face, but they're internal, and they might be a little easier to get a handle on. Then you have your external risks. So an example of this might be a natural disaster, a recession, or I don't know, maybe like a global pandemic maybe. But ultimately, these are outside decision-making. They're market forces, there's disasters, and ultimately they're harder to control. They're less out of our hands, but yet we still want to be mindful of them and be ready to prepare for them. So once we put in our baseline thinking, we can now focus on the future risks we face and our opportunities that we are pursuing. So what are some situations that might require longer-term planning? What questions can we ask? Well, some questions we can ask is, do we face potential funding loss? Another question may be, how does the current political situation affect your organization and your programs? Are we, scared of any potential staff turnover or leadership turnover? Are you planning on pursuing strategic partnerships? And another question may be, are you contemplating major growth or contraction? The real question then is, how do you organize all of this so it's actually useful and not just something that wakes you up at 3 a.m.? As your leadership thinks about those top risks what you want to know is, how big is the risk? What might be a flag that triggers us into action? So what are those drivers? What are those contexts that we want to be looking out for? And what is the plan of action if this should occur? Now, I encourage you all to take a second to really think about what these risks are. And we're going to put a poll in here in just a couple of seconds. But this is what we've seen at NFF. And I'm curious as to what organizations in this room have seen. And so in the upcoming poll, I encourage you to please select the top 2 risks you feel you're currently facing. All right, and so we're gonna close the poll in just a second. Perfect. And so what we see here, as the results have come in, 50% have felt that one of the biggest risks is potential funding loss, right? There's dynamics in the sector that make us uncertain as to how much funding is going to come in, how much funding is available, can we lose funding from one night to the next? And then the other one is growth or contraction. Perhaps we're grappling with questions on how do we continue to grow? We've been on this maybe growth trajectory. On the other hand, maybe there's factors outside of our control that are causing us to contract. Maybe we need to slow down. We need to shrink a bit. And so all of these are top of mind for us. And it's important to know these because then we can now think about how do we begin to manage these risks. So I appreciate you all sharing this. So now that we've spoken about the different types of risks that you all may be facing, again, it's that question, right? Often you've seen this question, how do we mitigate risk? And I want to acknowledge early on that the operating environment for our sector right now possesses a lot of risks. Pace of change feels accelerated, and realities that seemed immutable a few years ago don't seem that way anymore. It's easy to be overwhelmed and paralyzed by how much uncertainty you, as a leader, are trying to plan for. Now we're going to shift to talk through getting a handle on this and making a plan before you're in crisis. Because if that crisis ever happens, quick action will determine how well you emerge. So the goal is to focus on the process. When a crisis happens or an opportunity presents itself, you've done the thinking and the consensus building ahead of time, and you already know what to do. Now, you might not be able to erase risk entirely, but you can help to bring and control that risk for your organization. And so we changed this question from how do we mitigate risk to how do we manage risk, appreciating that risk is always going to exist, but planning for how we begin to manage that risk is going to be really critical. And so how do we start, right? Where do we begin? Well, first acknowledging that mission achievement relies not only on securing financial resources, but on being able to make continuous improvements to program delivery, which ultimately better serves our communities. Given the complexity and changing landscape, we need to focus both on the now and the future. And we do so through sustainable. So we want to make sure that we are sustainable, having enough resources to accomplish our mission now and in the future. We know that in the nonprofit sector, we're never going to be completely sustainable due to a reliance on third-party donors, and we're never guaranteed to last indefinitely. Really not even remotely guaranteed in the for-profit world, much less in the nonprofit world. There's no perfect business model or secret sauce, but we still want to have enough to be confident that we can deliver our mission this year and next year. Can we do what we said we'd do? In addition to sustainable, which is the now, we also think about the future. So being adaptable, having enough resources to meet changing needs now and in the future. The reality of nonprofit operation is a constant game of adaptation. Adaptable doesn't mean chasing whatever bright new thing is happening. Adaptable means being able to weather change, to continuously ensure our mission and theory of change is the right one, that we're meeting the needs we set out to meet to improve our mission and how we achieve our mission. Now, this sounds daunting, right? Like all good things, building sustainability and adaptability takes time, and with some prioritization happening along the way. So let's get into what I mean by that prioritization. So building long-term financial health requires a hierarchy of need. And appropriate capitalization can support these different types of needs. Now, what I mean by capitalization is really the resources, the nature, size, and resources that you have on your balance sheet. So that's all the resources that you have as an organization to fall back on when you need to mitigate risk. And these really resources fall into three different buckets, which we see here, from near term to long term. And this is really what we mean by our hierarchy of need. So the first one that we see here is liquidity. So do you have enough, right? Adequate access to cash to meet operating needs. Do you have enough of that? Do you have enough working capital to manage seasonality of your cash flow? Or perhaps to deal with the unexpected? So that's just to make sure that we are meeting our month-to-month operating needs. Next on the hierarchy of need is our adaptability. So how adaptable are we as an organization? Do we have flexible funds that allow for adjustments as circumstances change? Which is really money that allows your organization to evolve, reposition, collaborate, grow, or even contract as appropriate. Next up on the hierarchy of need, which is the last, is your durability. So do we have sufficient funds to address a range of future needs? And these are typically revealed by the presence of buildings, endowments, and very long-term savings. I do want to note that durability often is equated with sustainability. Many organizations that have achieved so-called durability lack the cash to manage their fixed assets, which really means that they are walking wounded. So I do want to mention that durability does not mean sustainability. And we'll get into kind of each of these three, liquidity, adaptability, and durability, in more depth. But I do want to mention that up front, that there is a hierarchy of need within every organization. And while many organizations focus on durability, it's liquidity that all organizations need to prioritize first. So let's talk about these in greater detail. So first up is liquidity. What does liquidity look like? Well, these can be cash easily available to management to pay bills on time, even during periods of negative cash flow. So how do I measure liquidity? So really that's your months of cash that you have on your balance sheet. So you would take your months of cash and you divide that by your monthly expenses to see how many months of cash you would have on hand. Now, often the question that we get is, how many months of cash do I need as an organization? And the answer is really specific to your organization. I was actually working with an organization who was really relying on government funding. And with government funding, sometimes they often take a long time to pay back the expenses that the organization bared up front to deliver the program. The reimbursement would take anywhere between 3 to 6 months. And so what that meant for this organization, it meant that they would need to have a lot of working capital and liquidity to make sure that they were able to weather those expenses upfront to cover those and have enough to ensure that they would be able to continue their operations until they were able to receive that reimbursement. And so for that organization, it may have meant that they needed about 6 months of liquidity. Now, for another organization who perhaps doesn't have much reliance on government funding, perhaps a lot of their funding comes in quickly, they don't need to bear upfront any expenses, perhaps maybe they don't need 6 months of liquidity, perhaps maybe they're able to do with 2 or 3. So it really depends on the needs of your organization, and you can determine these needs for your liquidity based on cash flow projections. I invite you to go on the MCC website to check out the cash flow session that we did previously, where we go over how to use the cash flow projection tool, which will ultimately inform your organization as to how many months of cash you should have, identifying those peaks and valleys in your cash flow and the timing of cash coming in and out. So now that we've covered liquidity, we can now talk about adaptability. So what does adaptability look like? These are your reserves for both risk and opportunity. We measure adaptability through months of available net assets. And again, the question is, how many months of ANA, of available net assets, do I need? The answer is specific to your organization again, and it should be determined through a risk and opportunities assessment. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say one, that you want to build the reserves because you are perhaps thinking about your funding and saying, well, actually there's one contract that I'm a little uncertain about. I feel like maybe next year, because of the political landscape, it's going to change. And I feel like maybe next year I won't have access to those funds anymore, which will then disrupt my programming. It would mean that I would need to think about ways to pay my staff that are tied to this contract. And so you would take that into consideration when building out your reserves and saying, okay, if this contract were to go away, I would want to have at least enough reserves to weather that gap for the next 3 to 6 months. You could use that to inform how much reserves you have. Another reserve just might be for your rainy day funds. As we've seen with COVID, rainy day funds are necessary for organizations, and you can determine how much is appropriate for you all, again, through a risks and opportunities assessment, seeing how much you need after you've addressed your working capital. What I've seen often some organizations is they'll go straight to building their reserves without addressing their liquidity. Again, that hierarchy of need. And if that happens, where they are trying to build out their reserves and not having enough to cover the timing of their cash throughout the year, what we'll see is that reserve will deplete real quick because they're often having to go back to the money they set aside to cover their day-to-day needs. And that's why it's important to follow that hierarchy of need to make sure that you are having enough in working capital to not have to draw down your reserve to meet those day-to-day needs. And so lastly is durability. What does durability look like? Well, these are fixed assets, perhaps maybe like facilities and equipment. They could be very long-term pledges, or endowments. Now, how much durability do I need? Again, the answer is specific to your organization. It depends on mission delivery strategy. And quite frankly, many organizations may need very little durability. Unlike a liquidity and adaptability, there is no really dynamic measure for durability, like months of cash or months of available net assets. But for most organizations, liquidity and adaptability are sufficient. And we're struggling even to get that, right? And so durability might not be in the picture because, again, it might not be necessary for your organization. Missions that are needed in the same way, in the same place for a long time need more durability. So we can think about this in terms of hospitals and schools. Now, others are better served by keeping their resources adaptable. Those doing advocacy, community organizations, or arts organizations would benefit most from addressing their liquidity, adaptability, and perhaps not thinking about the durability if it is not related to mission success. And so here's a quick snapshot. Again, oftentimes we get the question of, how much months of cash do we have? How many months available in net assets? And where should I focus on right now that we've addressed liquidity, adaptability, and durability? And so here are some goals that require us knowing where to focus, right? And so we have, from our right to the left, we have the need to take action now. What we see is these columns and these rows consistent of your operating surplus deficit. You have your months of cash, you have your months available net assets, and you have what to focus on. Again, this is just a quick benchmark. This is not set in stone, and oftentimes we see organizations fluctuate in and out a lot, right? And so again, this is not the gold standard. This is not something where if you don't find yourself in one category, that means you're doing something wrong. This is more of a framework to get a sense and a pulse check as to, are we focusing on the right things? Do I have the right resources depending on what my organization's mission is? And so we see for need to take action now, what this usually means is that you have less than 1 month of cash. And again, that's not to say that you are doing anything wrong. It's just to point out that perhaps you might be, tight on cash sometimes, and that might be difficult to manage. And same thing with your months of available net assets. So perhaps an area of focus here might be liquidity, right? How do we build up that 1 month of cash so we're not spending so much time trying to figure out how we're going to pay, the bills next month, and we're perhaps shifting our focus to more of building up our working capital and our reserves. Maybe you're in the vulnerable to shocks column, right? So you have about 1 to 2 months of cash, 1 to 2 months available net assets. And again, maybe perhaps you're still focusing on liquidity. I do want to go back to the example of perhaps maybe 1 to 2 months is enough for your organization, right? Perhaps maybe you don't feel like you're tight on cash. And so this is working just fine for you because of the way your funding works and the timing of your cash determined by your cash flow. And so again, this column might be fine for you as an organization. The next one is making it work. So your business model, the way you're making and spending money, is producing small surpluses. You have about 2 to 5 months of cash on hand. You have about 2 to 5 months of available net assets. And so perhaps maybe here you're focusing still on building up your liquidity, but now you're also thinking about your adaptability, right? Thinking about those reserves, thinking about how much you should have on a rainy day fund. And then the last column is handles risks. So you're building consistent surpluses. You have about more than 6 months of cash on hand. You have more than 6 months available net assets. And perhaps maybe now in addition to adaptability, since you've covered your liquidity, you're now also thinking about durability if it is something that is required by your organization. So I want to pause here for a little bit. And now that I've spoken kind of on the focus and how we can plan for risks, I want to see from the people in this room, so we're going to do a poll. Where do you feel you're focusing on right now, or where you should be focusing on right now in terms of liquidity, adaptability, or durability? And it's also okay to be unsure. So if you're unsure where you're focusing right now as an organization, feel free to select unsure as well. There is no right or wrong answer. All right, we're going to be closing the poll in just a second. And so based on the results here, it's evenly split, right? A lot of us are focusing on liquidity. A lot of us are focusing on adaptability. We're split halfway through, and that's completely fine. Again, appreciating that there are a lot of inequities and systemic barriers in this sector that just make our funding dynamics extremely difficult, right? And so to even begin to think about building our liquidity and having 3 months of cash on hand, in addition to having 3 months of reserves, can be daunting again. But it's important to keep these things in mind as we continue to go through our conversation today of one, just not knowing how much we should have on hand to manage risk. How do we communicate that, right? And how do we build up kind of these months of cash and months of available net assets? How do we begin to think about building these and communicating them to stakeholders? And so that's where we'll be taking our conversation next. Before that, I'm just going to pause to see if there's any questions, any comments, any reflections before we move on and talk about how do we begin to think about building up our liquidity and adaptability. All right, seeing no questions, we'll go ahead and move on. If you do have any questions at any point in time, feel free to pop them into the Q&A and we'll make sure to get those answered. So now that we've spoken about what our focus is and how we can plan for risk, what are ways in which we can build and communicate this, right? This is extremely important as well because it's not only talking about what we need, but it's also making sure that we get it and how do we communicate that need. So let's go ahead and dive into that. And so one of the ways is through consistent surpluses. And I've mentioned this throughout the conversation today a couple of times, but consistent surpluses build liquidity, adaptability, and durability. What we see here is this wheel, which may look familiar to you all if you've seen this before, if you've attended our sessions before. But what we have on the left is our business model. It's really the way we make and spend money in service of our mission. So the revenues, the expenses, and what we have left over. Are you able to cover your costs? It's ultimately the bottom line. It's ultimately what we're asking ourselves when we're taking a look at our business model. Now, through our business model, we then hope to build consistent surpluses because these consistent surpluses, which we see up top here in the wheel, is what is going to help build our liquidity and adaptability. This is generally how we think about what happens on the finance side and what we know is helpful in building up financial health. But again, we know that the reality right now is that surpluses may not be realistic. That might be fine if you have cash or other resources available to support it. It takes money to adapt your business model and to build the resources dedicated to serving your mission in the short and the long term. And so again, surpluses, it's really an indicator of a strong business model that throws off surpluses sufficient to invest back into the organization. So what we see here through our wheel, through our capital structure. Again, our capital structure is really just the nature, size, and distribution of the resources that we have. And so that's our liquidity, adaptability, and our durability. And we build these through our consistent surpluses. Again, the question that we're always asking is, do we have access to enough cash to meet those different needs in a hierarchy? And so sticking on the topic of consistent surpluses, one of the challenges is communicating the use of a surplus, right? Oftentimes, some funders or board members demand a zero bottom line. So one of the ways to kind of mitigate this and push back is to explain why. So budgeting to break even will not cover all of the organization's costs, and it really undermines the ability to deliver our mission in the long run. And I encourage you to show it in your reports. So in your budgets, indicate plans for use of surpluses through below the line budgeting to demonstrate good management and satisfy the request for a balanced budget. What is below the line budgeting and what does that look like? Well, here's an example of a budget. And just to orient you to what this budget is showing us, for this organization, Marine Center budget, they have the revenue at the top and their expenses at the bottom. So we're very familiar with this structure. They have their program fees, their foundation grants, their individual contributions, and their total revenue. Then below that, they have their expenses. So they have their personnel, their professional fees, their occupancy, and their depreciation. And they have their total expenses. Then they also have their bottom line, which is operating surplus deficit. Now below that, this is where the below the line budgeting comes into play. Below that surplus or deficit, they've identified those balance sheet needs. And for this organization, their balance sheet needs are one, working capital, again, addressing that liquidity. They've demonstrated that they need 150,000 for this year, and they are budgeting for it to build their working capital, again, to build their months of cash that they have on hand to cover the timing of their expenses. Another balance sheet need that this organization has identified is fixed asset additions, right? They want to purchase some new computers. As we all know, equipment can be expensive, and so we want to make sure that staff have the appropriate equipment to continue delivering on the mission. And this organization has identified fixed asset additions as a need for the organization this year. And so they have budgeted, again, below the line, $30,000 to cover this need. And so what we're seeing here is that they are communicating the intentional use of that $49,000 surplus. However, what this means is that after addressing this working capital and fixed asset addition need, they are now actually having a shortfall, right? After they've included all of the costs that they have identified for the organization to run effectively, they're now looking at it incurring a deficit for the year. And so this is important because now we're able to communicate our long-term needs to both funders, to stakeholders, and to the board to really get their support in not only addressing our first bottom line, but again, now below the line, which is inclusive of our balance sheet needs. I do see a comment here. For an organization that uses endowment funds to fund operating, how might you represent that? Does that suggest a deficit on operating? Great question, Kristen. And I'm going to assume that the endowment that you have is a permanent endowment, which means that all the funds that you have in there you're not able to touch them, and that you are using the investment activity from it. And so, perfect, great assumption. Thank you. And so does that suggest a deficit on operating? And so it really depends on the organization. I mean, I've seen some organizations that would budget for perhaps break even before taking into consideration the endowment. You just started there last week. Congratulations on the new position. But great question nonetheless. It seems like you're asking the right questions. But again, I think it depends on the organization. I've seen some organizations who would budget to break even and then take into account their investment activity from their endowment and then have that push them over to produce surpluses. I've also seen organizations budget for a surplus and not take into account what they're going to get from their investments activity. And so I think, it really depends on your organization. What I would encourage at the end of the day is to make sure that you are just budgeting for enough of a surplus, right? And so if you're going to count on your investment activity, that is completely fine. It is a revenue source for your organization that your organization has deemed. And so again, I would just holistically look at it from the sense of, do we have enough surplus to cover these balance sheet needs, whether that's coming through inclusive of the investment activities or not. So it's more of a holistic approach. I hope that answered your question. Great. Good question. All right. And so that would be an example of below the line budgeting. So again, for this below the line budgeting, it really helps us to set goals internally, right? So we're communicating why we need a surplus and what we need it for. And that goes to that second bullet, which is being specific, being intentional about what we need this surplus for. What is the surplus going to cover for our organization? Because instead of going to a funder and showing a $49,000 surplus without showing the balance sheet needs, the funder might say, well, why do you need my funding if you are projecting, a big surplus? And so that gives us back the power of our narrative to show, no funder, in addition to this 49,000, I actually still need 150 for working capital. I need 30,000 for my fixed asset additions, which ultimately means I'm actually at a shortfall, right? And so this is why I still need your funding, because I have identified these longer term needs for my organization that are going to both make me sustainable and adaptable to improve my mission delivery and success. And so again, adapting these communications to the audience. Now, you know your funders best. I've had some organizations who have been like, well, I've showed this to a funder and they've been like, I don't want to see all this. Just tell me what you need. And so some other funders have been receptive and they've appreciated this demonstrating of these balance sheet needs. Ultimately, you know your funder best, but this is a great tool to communicate those needs. And so keep this in mind as you're building out your budget and identifying your hierarchy of needs. And so we address kind of one way to build a healthy capital structure was through consistent surpluses. But another way is really through periodic investments. So that's really our one-time investments. These can look like capital infusions. So perhaps external infusions of capital that can be invested in business adaptation or enterprise needs. Now, some capitalization priorities tend to be more readily addressed with a one-time capital raise. These funds are expected to be spent down or their designated purpose and not replenished necessarily on an annual basis. So examples of this may be major building improvements or relocation. So if you do have a facility, a one-time investment to support the renovation or to support some improvements in your facilities. This could be a great example of a one-time investment from a funder. Another example of this might be recovery funds. So to pay back any debt. And then also a program or opportunity reserve. So funds to be spent for revenue generating capacity or programmatic pilots. I was actually working with this organization who was thinking of starting back one of their programs that they had to cut a couple of years ago. And they mentioned that they would not start that program until they had enough funding, one-time funding as a kind of startup capital to cover the initial costs for 1 year. And so I thought that that was a really great way to think about it because they were hoping to get that one-time investment from a funder to start that program. And they knew that if they weren't going to get that one-time investment, then they were not going to start that program because they were unable to incur those costs that it would take on their own through consistent surpluses. And so keeping in mind that sometimes one-time investments are really helpful to build up your healthy capital structure. And again, capital structure in terms of the nature, size, and distribution of the resources we have. So building long-term financial health can be looked at through two different lenses, right? We have our local on the left, which can be thought of as our surpluses. The surpluses are the local train because often surpluses are modest year to year. So supporting liquidity, adaptability, and durability through surpluses may take time. Building consistent surpluses year over year is a difficult thing to achieve in the nonprofit sector, as you all can appreciate. Again, going back to the funding dynamics, the landscape, systemic barriers, it makes it all difficult for nonprofits to break even, nevertheless, produce surpluses, nevertheless, to do that consistently year over year on top of growth, right? And so while we always encourage organizations to budget for a surplus to cover these needs that they may have, we also appreciate that those take time. And so there's also the express train was on the right. It's a little faster. And this is building long-term financial health through periodic capital infusions, which can then fund liquidity, adaptability, and durability investments a lot quicker. Now, one is not better or worse than the other. It's just noting the difference. Now, there's also a combination of both, right? And so perhaps some of your needs are through operating surpluses and one-time investments. Perhaps the ability to start your reserve is going to be through a one-time capital infusion, but then you're going to continue to build up that reserve through consistent surpluses, through budgeting, below the line budgeting and putting that in your budget as your balance sheet needs. And those two would go hand in hand, both your operating surpluses, but also your one-time capital infusions. Let me pause here and see if there's any questions from you all before we move on. All right, seeing no questions, we'll go ahead and move on. So what are some main takeaways of today's session, right? One is that financial health is a journey, it's not a destination. And so being able to adopt the practice of budgeting to a surplus and making progress on your goals over time. Again, appreciating that operating surpluses year over year are difficult to achieve in the nonprofit sector. But remember that it's a journey, not a destination. And so as you're thinking about building up your reserves, as you're thinking about building up your working capital, keep that in mind. That perhaps maybe one year you'll be able to set aside some money for your working capital, maybe the next you won't be able to, but it is fine because you have your goal and you have something that you are striving for. Also remembering the hierarchy of need. Liquidity comes first, right? We address liquidity, adaptability, and durability. Again, if you are thinking about your liquidity, making sure that you are addressing your working capital first. That way, when it's time to build your build your reserves, you'll have enough. That way, you won't have to be constantly pulling from your reserve to address your working capital needs. And so making sure that you are thinking about your liquidity before your adaptability and durability. Also determine the metrics that are right for your organization. Again, think about how much liquidity is enough for you as an organization, depending on the type of revenue that you have, depending on the programs that you are engaging in, how much liquidity is enough for your organization. Again, evident through and informed by a cash flow projections tool, how much adaptability is needed for your organization, dependent on a risk assessment for your organization, risk and opportunities assessment. So keeping those in mind, informed by the financials, informed by the data, but also your gut, right? And so if you feel like you need 3 to 4 months of liquidity because, that's just, it's going to be enough for you to feel like you don't have to worry about keeping the lights on, you don't have to worry about payroll, then make that your goal, right? It's both an art and a science. And so keeping those two perspectives in mind when you're determining how much liquidity and adaptability you need is really important as an organization. And lastly, it's help the sector do better. So talk with other funders and nonprofits about the importance of surpluses. Again, there's a stigma in the nonprofit sector that nonprofits don't need surpluses, and that's completely false. Nonprofit is a tax status, it's not a business model, and so we need surpluses to make sure that we are effective on our mission delivery. And so open the conversation with your grantors or grantees, if you're a funder as well, with your funders, and I think support kind of this thinking through surpluses. Now, this is on us as well. We recognize that oftentimes you're like, well, the funders always push back and they don't like funding surpluses. And you're not wrong, right? And so that's why NSF is also having these conversations with funders about supporting surpluses. We're engaging with them to make the whole sector really appreciate the need for surpluses and not this scarcity mindset. And so I just want to let you all know that we're also having these conversations with funders to demystify some of these, some of the thinking that comes with surpluses for nonprofit organizations. And so the learning goals for today were really, one, to develop an understanding of different types of organizational financial risks. So we went through defining what risk is as both not a good or bad, but it's neutral, right? And it's what we make out of it. They're both risks and opportunities. We've identified several types of risks, internal, external. And so thinking about what types of risks we as an organization may be facing, and then using that to inform how we're beginning to build skills to manage risks with an aim towards long-term financial health. So now that we know what risks our organization perhaps may be susceptible to, how do we begin to think about how do we manage those? How do we begin to think about how much liquidity, adaptability, and durability do we need as an organization to make sure that when risks do arrive at our door, we're able to push back, right? Again, appreciating that we're not here to mitigate risks because risks are inevitable, but managing risks is really important, and it's more important than being able to mitigate them. Another component that I do want to mention is oftentimes when we think about now and the future, we're always caught up in thinking of wanting to know the future, right? And there's a difference between knowing the future and knowing of the future. And so we're never going to know the future for certainty, but we can best begin to think about what we can, how we can perhaps think about those risks and what is at play in terms of context that will help us know of the future versus knowing the future. Um, I do see someone has raised their hands, but I don't see a question. Um, Ellen, did you have a question? Well, if you do have a question, I encourage you to put it in the Q&A or the chat. That way I'm able to see it and address the question. I want to make sure that it gets answered. Okay. Okay, and then once we begin to build those risks or build those skills to manage the risks, we then can begin to understand ways to communicate our long-term needs to stakeholders. Again, that goes back to now that we know what risks we may be facing as an organization, we have begun to think about our liquidity needs, our adaptability needs, and our durability needs. How do we begin to communicate that to our stakeholders? How do we begin to take back the power of our narrative and show that through our budgeting, our below the line budgeting, to ensure that we are able to communicate that and push back on that stigma of that nonprofits don't need surpluses. As we begin to check out, I encourage you to share any of the following in the chat. So head, heart, and feet. Anything that you learned from today's session. The heart, how did today's session make you feel? And the feet, what actions will you take to bring this back to your organization and community? So I encourage you to share in the chat something that you may have learned today that you will either be taking to your organization as an action or just something that you will be taking away as knowledge. And lastly, I encourage you all to attend our next session, which is Understanding Full Cost. This session will be on June 8th at 1 p.m. same time. Today, we spoke about liquidity, adaptability, and durability, and we gave some examples of working capital and reserves. But really at Nonprofit Finance Fund, we use a term called full cost, which really encompasses several other types of needs beyond working capital and reserves that fall into kind of these liquidity, adaptability, and durability buckets. And so in this upcoming session, we'll cover that full cost framework and identify all of those needs that organizations may need as they begin to think about including them in their budget, including them in terms of holistically thinking about what it takes their organization to run effectively now, but also in the long haul. And so my colleague, Ashley Franks, will be covering full cost in the next section. Again, full cost, I like to think about it as a framework where it really kind of dives into our organization's spirit animals, where we're taking them into consideration when we're budgeting and helping us make decisions about our organization. And so I encourage you all to attend this session. All right. And I'll just pause one last time for questions before I let you all go today.
And I'll just come on while we're waiting for those last questions to come in. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to Johnny for providing this this content in a really digestible, easy to understand format. We appreciate that for sure. Also coming up in our session, as you're thinking about your last question here for Johnny, we have two that I wanted to highlight. Sarah and Johnny just talked about our full cost one. That's next Tuesday, same time of the week. This Thursday, we're having a workshop on how to run a capital campaign during times of stress. A lot of our organizations were mid-capital campaigns when COVID came. So we have a lot of tips and tricks on how to push through that, or how do you pause, or how do you adapt on a capital campaign through this. And then also, next Thursday, some of you may remember Sandy McKinley, who did a few workshops with us. She will be back to talk about using your life cycle, your organization's life cycle, to inform planning. So whether you're a startup or you've been around for a while, how to use life cycle theory in order to determine where you go from here. So those are all coming up later on. All right. And are there any other questions? We've got just a few moments left if anybody wants to put any in. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up and give you 4 minutes back. So thank you, Johnny, for providing this for us. All of you will get an email when this is ready to share it along with your folks. You can watch videos and get worksheets on the cash flows that Johnny talked about or scenario planning. We've got a lot of resources. We're actually building out a section on our website that takes all of this stuff, putting it together, and then gives you a capacity building toolkit. So we're working on that right now. We'll launch that in a couple weeks, but that way you can have access to everything that we've been talking about this whole spring. So with that in mind, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it. Thank you again, Johnny, and all of our friends at Nonprofit Finance Fund, and have a great rest of the day. We'll see you at the next workshop. Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.